Hey guys, this is Navinad with my third installment of my Silver Bullet series, hoping that you will watch it and get better faster. This is going to be about understanding range advantage, and I want to apologize in advance. I'm losing my voice, a little bit under the weather. If I'm coughing or whatnot, I do apologize, or clearing my throat, for instance. So, range advantage is a very powerful concept, and it's something that some players have very little understanding of, and I think that even pretty good players don't have a very good understanding of it, and a lot of players don't understand it really the way that they ought to, and they don't understand it or have the complete understanding that they believe they have. So I'll try to shed a little bit of light on it. This is mostly going to be an introduction, again, not teaching you exactly what to do or answering a ton of questions, but helping you figure out what questions you ought to be asking yourself. So it's not sufficient to look at a flop and say, this flop crushes player A's range and widely misses player B's range. Certainly there's a case for recognizing those situations, but that's really just step one. You've got to be able to recognize what flops interact with what ranges in a stronger way. But there's different forms of that strength. Just thinking in terms of this is good or bad for my range might not really cut it if you're really trying to optimize your play against especially players who are thinking along the same lines. There's another whole list of things to consider other than just, is my range better or worse than my opponent's range on this board? We're going to be talking mostly about flops, but of course this is going to this concept will extend beyond just the flop. It'll go into turns and rivers as well. So yeah, some of the things: strong, yeah, sure; weak, yeah. My range can be weak on this flop, turn, river. But it can also be that one player has the stronger range overall, but the other range has more nutted value, so it's less capped. Maybe it's more polarized. One range could be uncapped, unbound, and it's very polarized. Another range could be stronger on average in general overall, but it's more of a value merged range where there's not so many super strong nutted value hands and not so many bluffs. It's just kind of a bluff catcher heavy board. Some will be draw heavy, some will be air heavy, and this is I think this P versus BC scenario comes up a lot when players are trying to describe kind of this concept, or really when they're trying to describe game theory as it applies to no limit hold'em poker. They'll often talk about this polar versus bluff catcher situation where the players get to a flop, really a board. They get to some spot in the game, some street where the game state is such where one player has a lot of air, or a lot of bluffs, I should say, semi-bluffs, and then eventually bluffs on the river, and nutted value hands, and the other player has pretty strictly, pretty good, but not nutted value hands in his range. An example might be an average player opens from middle position in a 6-max game, like he opens the hijack, and a good player, average player, defends the big blind. He just flat calls the big blind, and the flop comes out something like Jack 10 7 with two hearts, and it goes check, bet, raise, call. The turn bricks off, and the guy that check raised, the big blind pre-flop caller, puts in a pot-sized bet on the turn, and the river kind of bricks off, or maybe some semi-brick that just completes maybe like one gut shot straight, or some other unlikely maybe backdoor flush draw that came in after the check raise, so it's a relative brick. And then maybe the guy that check raised the flop and bombed the turn set it up so that he's got about 1.2 pot size bets behind, so an SPR of 1.2 or 1.2 to 1, and he just rips it in. Then you could describe the situation as the pre-flop caller's range being polarized, and the pre-flop open raiser, his range would be bluff catcher. We won't explore the actual mathematics of this, not in this video, but that's just a description of a situation where it's not sufficient to say one player's range is strong and the other's is weak. There's other things that need to be taken into account to really plan our lines and think logically, and think eloquently, elegantly, efficiently. So there are spots when you're playing really just your range against another player's range. Usually this is going to be you are a good thinking player, you're playing against another player who is a good thinking player, and he knows that you're a good thinking player, and he also knows that you know that he is. In situations like this, range advantage can be everything. There are spots in game theory that occur where one player's range is sufficiently strong to capture an entire pot on the river with literally any bet size that is even a legal bet size. And there are spots where it's just the case that one player's range contains so few bluffs that his opponent, if he is a good hand reader, should never bluff catch against him. One example of a hand like that would be, let's say we have this dynamic of good thinking player against good thinking player. They both recognize each other as such, and good thinking player A opens the button for a raise, and the big blind, the good thinking player in the big blind, becomes pre-flop caller. He flats, and the flop comes out ace 10 4 rainbow. In fact, let's say ace 10 5. So the flop comes out ace 10 5 rainbow. The action goes check, bet, call. The turn bricks off some kind of like 8 offsuit, and some 8 that maybe opens a backdoor flush draw, but shouldn't be super relevant. And the player that check called the flop now checks again, and the player that bet the flop, the pre-flop raiser, checks back. So the flop, or the turn rather, checks through. So ace 10 5 on the flop. It goes check, pre-flop raiser, bets, pre-flop caller, calls. The turn is a relative brick. The turn checks through. On the river, a king comes. And in this spot, if pre-flop caller, big blind, out of position player, bets, say he makes a, 2/3 pot kind of standard looking bet on the river, it is really hard for that player to have a bluff in that spot. And his opponent, the other good thinking player, should not only realize that, but realize that he realizes that. So it's going to be pretty hard in a spot like that for the player in the big blind to get value from many of his hands. So it is possible to end up in spots where even the bottom of your range has some showdown value. And just to kind of put a little bit more, detail in that example where we have a pre-flop raise and call out of the big blind, ace 10 5 rainbow flop, check, bet, call. We have to look at what that call means. Like, what is a good thinking player calling, check calling on ace 10 5 rainbow? He's probably got some pocket pairs that he's going to peel. Maybe he's got some weak pairs that he flopped that are going to check and call once. And then maybe the rest of it is like value hands that he's hoping to check raise the turn with, or just good strong hands that he's planning on playing for like 2 streets of value, like a good ace, like an ace 10, an ace jack, something like that. But the only draws in the pre-flop caller, the big blind's range, on this ace 10 4 are probably going to be hands like king jack, maybe queen jack, king jack, hands that maybe king queen if he doesn't 3-bet it, hands that are basically just gut shots to Broadway, might peel. Those are really the only draws that the player's likely to check and call with. And when the turn action is check check, then the player that's in the big blind, the pre-flop caller that check called on ace 10 5 rainbow, when he makes a good sized bet on the river, when the king gets there on the river, all of his gut shots became either second pair or a Broadway straight. So that guy just never has a hand that he can really bluff with. He just never gets to this spot with air. So if he's very rarely, I can't say never, but he's very rarely getting to this spot with air, once he bets, he's betting a hand for value, right? So you have to look at it and say, is he going to be value betting hands that I can beat. And as pre-flop raiser, once I check back the turn, it's pretty unlikely that I have a hand strong enough to call that bet. And this is just in a normal situation with normal dynamics, and specifically with people who have not yet watched my video. The thing is really, if you find yourself in a spot where you don't have air very often, if at all, then if your opponent's good, he should be very, very reluctant to call, because if he's bluff catching and you don't have any bluffs, then he's just setting money on fire, right? So if villain's a good hand reader, you have to have some bluffs here for two reasons. Number one, you have to have bluffs in your range so you can get value bets paid off without just having to bet the nuts. And the other thing is because you should be able to leverage, say, the bottom of your range and get your opponent to fold a lot of hands if he is indeed a good hand reader and a disciplined, good, solid poker player. So in these spots where you get into a situation where you just have very, very, very little air or no air, you've got to be careful about the hands you choose to value bet and who you're value betting against. And it may be the case that you really can't bet anything for value but the nuts, because your opponent's just never going to give you action with anything that is not beating your top pair second kicker or whatever is the case. So if you're in a spot where you have very, very little air, then you can't value bet as thinly. If you're in a spot where you have very little air, you should have a lot of leverage with your bluffs, but the problem is most even good players, decent players, when their range is extremely strong, it is extremely strong because they don't have any bluffs to leverage, and mediocre to good, decent players are probably too reluctant to turn made hands at the bottom of their range into bluffs. Like, let's say we get to that flop of ace 10 5 rainbow with a hand like pocket sevens or 6-5 suited. Maybe we've got 6-5 suited with backdoor, we've got the backdoor straight draw. Well, okay, 5-4 suited would be a backdoor straight draw. So we've got three to the wheel, and maybe we've got like backdoor flush draw, and we've got a pair. It might be a good idea to take one off in that spot and see what happens on the turn. Once the turn checks through, don't just look at your pocket sevens or your 6-5 or your 5-4 suited and decide, hey, this is too strong a hand to bluff with. It's got showdown value. I should check. You need to be adding some bluffs to your ranges in spots where you very rarely have air. And if you rarely have air, the bluffs necessarily have to be hands that you would consider to have some kind of showdown value. So yeah, in these spots, be careful about value betting too thinly, and this is what we should do. We should be careful about value betting too thinly against good players, and we should also look for spots to bluff more than we're probably bluffing right now. So what should you do? Stay constantly aware of your range and where the hand you have right now fits within the overall distribution of all the hands you could get to in any given decision point. Be aware of board coverage when you're constructing your ranges. If you're in a spot where you can't have air, it's very unlikely that you have air, bluff more, turn the bottom of your range into bluffs, and just value bet less. If you're getting into a lot of spots where you just don't have any air, and you have kind of a face-up range, then you might want to look at your opening ranges and basically your pre-flop game, and see if you can adjust your ranges in such a way that you cover more boards. That's going to help you in two ways. And this is going back to this idea of board coverage. If you're constructing a range and you want to be X%, you want to have an X% open range from, say, under the gun, and to get to that open range, you think it would be good to splash in a couple of hands that are maybe break even in a vacuum. If you're playing against players that you feel like you have a skill edge over, you're playing relatively deep, then maybe full ring even, you might be thinking about splashing in some like middle suited connectors. Well, maybe instead of splashing in 10-9 suited, it would be a good idea to splash in 8-7 suited. If they're both going to perform more or less equal in a vacuum, choose the hand as part of your range that's going to increase the overall value of your range the most, and that's going to be hands that give you better board coverage. And the reason, again, is twofold. Because by splashing hands in that cover more boards and have less overlap, 7-6 suited is going to overlap a lot less than 10-9 suited will with the other stuff you're likely to open from early position. If you're opening like, ace-10 suited, maybe king-10 and queen-10 suited, then 10-9 suited is going to hit a lot of the same flops, a lot of the same boards as other parts of your range, ace-10, king-10, queen-10 suited, depending on how you're opening. And also with queen-jack. Queen-jack will cover some of the same boards that 10-9 covers. But a hand like 9-8 or even 7-6 or 8-7 suited may be just as good in a vacuum EV, but it's going to give you more opportunities to leverage spots where you do have a very strong range, and it's going to give you strong hands on boards that your opponent would think missed you. So both of those things are good reasons to splash in hands that are maybe break-even-ish. Maybe you'll turn a small profit with them if you're a good player, that cover more boards. Just taking this idea and this concept of board coverage to heart when you're constructing your pre-flop ranges will go a long way. Should we be worried about this idea of range advantage? And should we, do we need to consider it against bad players? Do we need to think like, well, I opened under the gun and the flop came out, ace, queen, 9, rainbow, or ace, king, jack, rainbow, or, something ace, king, queen? Should we think like, well, I just never miss this board with my under the gun open raising range, so I can't really value bet a hand like ace X or top pair with a decent kicker. No, I mean, we shouldn't really be thinking too much about it. If we're thinking that our opponent's a fish and he's not thinking along those lines, then we don't really need to worry too much about value betting, like not value betting thinly against this guy and turning the weaker parts of our range into bluffs against this guy. But it is very important for us to do that against good thinking players, and it's very important for us to still consider villain's range, even if he's an unthinking poker zombie. That's my term for a non-thinking player, is a poker zombie. So if he's dead money, he's a zombie, whatever. He's unthinking. So I borrow the term from philosophy. The philosophical zombie is just the person who acts like they're thinking, but they're really not thinking. They're not able. They're not conscious. So it's still important for us to consider our opponent's range. He's going to have reasons to do things, and he's going to play a range of hands. His ranges might not be tight enough, and they might be kind of oddly constructed, but there will be a range, and we do have to consider how hard that board that we're thinking about c-betting or barreling on interacts with his range based on the actions that we've seen him take, his propensities, and so on. He still has a range. We should still be very wary of that part of it, but we shouldn't really be overly concerned about him thinking about who has range advantage and what our equity distributions look like and things like that. So of course not. But what we should get in the habit of doing, and I think this really is the whole thing, is we need to be aware of what we're representing at every decision point. Whenever we're making an aggressive action, we're betting or raising, we really have to think of what we're doing as sort of spreading as much disinformation as possible, telling a story, all of these things that people tend to think about very well when it comes to bluffing, but they largely discount when they think about value betting. It is, most decent players understand that when they're bluffing, they need to be able to legitimately represent a value hand and tell a consistent story before setting up and then firing with a bluff. But the same thing is true when you're value betting, especially if you're value betting sort of thinly. The more, say, busted draws in your range, the more thinly you can value bet. Because when you value bet a hand, you really ought to be able to represent bluffs or weaker hands. If you can't represent a bluff or a weaker hand than the hand you're value targeting, you can't expect this player, if he's a good thinking player, to call you with the hand that you're targeting. If you get to the river in a spot where you've got a pretty good idea of your opponent's range, you're ahead of your opponent's range, you're value targeting specific spots, certain hands in your opponent's range. If you don't have any hands in your range that are weaker than the value targets, you're going to have a pretty hard time getting called. And you can actually end up in situations where you really can't value bet anything but the nuts. If you end up in those situations too often, then you're maybe doing something incorrect or suboptimal before you get to that point. It might not be that you get to this spot, say you're at the top of your range, and you still can't call a raise, or you're at the top of your range and you still can't value bet. There may be nothing at all wrong with how you've played post-flop. It could go back to your pre-flop range construction. So, or when you get to the river and you're in one of these spots and you're thinking like, man, what did I do? Like, what do I do now? This is such an awkward situation. Well, it could be something you did earlier in the hand. You know, maybe when you were selecting between two options on the flop, they both had approximately the same EV. You should have thought a little bit more about what it did to your overall range and how your range is going to look to your opponent. So when you have two options of similar EV, you generally ought to choose the one that leaves your range more concealed. And as a general rule, it also makes sense to, again, when two options are similar in EV, you should very often take the option that uncaps your range rather than caps it. And all of that is, of course, situational. But some things to think about. So remember, we should always know what hands are in our range. We should tend to value bet the top of our range. We should tend to bluff with the bottom of our range, or the most appropriate, weakest parts of our range, taking blockers and things like that into account. And the rest of our range we really shouldn't be betting. So when we're getting to the flop with range advantage, okay, if we have a massive range advantage on the flop, you do have complete license to bluff. The problem is, not problem, but the situation is that the reason you have complete license to bluff your air is because you very rarely have air, or you just have a lot of not air. Another thing to remember, and well, not remember, you maybe don't know this, is in game theory optimal, in GTO considerations, there is no such thing as initiative. Pre-flop raiser does not have this magical thing called initiative that allows him, and only him, to make profitable flop bets. It's not the case. The reason that pre-flop raiser tends, and probably ought to tend, to c-bet flops, and the reason that pre-flop caller probably ought to default check to the raiser in a lot of spots is because pre-flop raiser will tend to have a wider, more polarized, less merged, less mediocre range, and that's going to give him more incentive to bet because he's going to want to bluff with his air, and he's going to want to value bet his big hands, and he's just got more air and he's got more big hands when he's got a wider, more polar distribution. Pre-flop caller ought to tend to check to pre-flop raiser, if for no other reason than simply we can expect pre-flop raiser to continuation bet a high percent of the time. And if we know he's going to see bet, we don't really have any incentive to bet ourselves. But there are flops where this ceases to be the case. There are flops and boards where it's no longer the case that the player that made the last aggressive action still has the most incentive to bet. When your range as pre-flop caller is, if your range interacts with the flop texture very strongly, and especially in a situation where your range will contain a lot of nutted value hands and a lot of draws, then you really ought to be the one that is putting that first bet in. Conversely, as pre-flop raiser, if you get to a flop that's very bad for your overall range, and your opponent's range kind of is smashed by the flop, then it's a pretty good idea to heavily consider checking back instead of c-betting, and checking to the caller if you're out of position as pre-flop raiser. So when you get into these spots, like these middling suited connected type boards that are going to favor pre-flop caller's range, and you have something like pocket aces or two over cards, or even if you just happen to just smash a set on like Jack 10 8 and you've got pocket jacks, even at the top of your range, it makes sense to just check your entire range back against a good thinking player, because you're going to check back your like ace kings and just probably give up with them, and you're going to check back your mediocre hands and then call down with them, and you're going to check back your nutted value hands to kind of represent the air that you hope your opponent will bet into. So these are, again, just thinking about range advantage and how our pre-flop ranges interact with the flop texture and board textures and how it should influence our play. And yeah, I guess you can see that when the flop or turn or river, when the board runs out in such a way that it really favors your range, if you're never getting into these spots with the opportunity to bluff, then you probably need to go back and analyze your overall strategy. And I have found oftentimes this leak is not in an obvious place. It can be something like we're 3-betting the wrong hands. But just being aware and paying attention to these situations is going to give you a huge leg up on players who don't, and it's going to really help you keep your head above water against players who do. Also, it's going to make poker a little bit, well, it's going to turn poker into chess, where you may be playing like a checkers version of it. This is what's going to get you from a decent or a mediocre player to somebody who can really compete at a, like higher level. Okay, so I've got some examples. I think these are kind of interesting examples, and I'll try to wrap it up here. Hero opens 3 times the big blind from cutoff. Villain defends his big blind, and we go to the flop of ace, king, king, rainbow. Now, if you do have a ton of air here, you may be opening too wide, right? But if you have no air here, you're probably not opening wide enough. Second example, villain opens from the cutoff 3 times the big blind, and you call from the big blind. The flop is Jack 10 9 two-tone. Your range should really murder this flop, and villain really ought to know that. It's okay for you to donk bet here. It's okay for you to lead into him for a few reasons. Number one, we cannot expect him to do our betting for us. So when we have a nutted value hand, we don't want to miss the chance to get value from his ace-jack or his pocket aces when he checks it back, and then even especially if scare cards come off, he may be able to get away much easier than he ought to be able to get away. And the other reason is when we do get into this spot with air, we want to be able to take him off of his hand. So we do have incentive to bet when the board hits our range harder than it hits our opponent's range. We're out of position. Even as pre-flop caller, we have license to make value bets on a board if our opponent doesn't hit that board very well and it's obvious and he's likely to check back. Again, because we want to be able to value bet and get 3 streets some of the time with hands like pocket 9s that are now sets, Jack 10, which is top 2, and we want to be able to get folds from our draws. When we have a draw here, or even when we have air here, it can be perfectly acceptable to bet as a bluff. We're going to want to have some hands in our range that bet one time as a bluff and then check fold on turns, or we're going to be playing out of balance. And we're going to want to have some bluffs that will barrel and then maybe at least check call unimproved. So these are flops like 10-9, 8, or Jack 10-9, or 10-9-7, two-tone, that are going to favor pre-flop caller, depending on the positions, playing styles, etc., stack depth, history, metagame, table dynamics. There's going to be a lot of caveats here. But in general, there are a lot of flops that give us complete license to take the pre-flop or the post-flop lead and donk bet flops. We ought to be donk betting some flops. You definitely would be donk betting a pretty good number of flops as pre-flop caller out of position in a game theory optimal situation. Okay, so OS tag. By OS tag, I mean, and this is some more examples and we'll close out. This is an old school tight aggressive player versus a lag, like a loose aggressive player. The OS tag, my definition of OS tag, is somebody who has an open limping range and an open raising range, but he tends to play raise or fold poker pre-flop. He's often going to be the pre-flop raiser. When he has Broadway cards, he's going to tend to either 3-bet them or fold them. He's going to limp in or just flat call with his speculative hands, and he may be opening, like in this example, if he open raises, that's the important part, he's open raising under the gun, full ring. He's not probably going to be open raising pocket sixes, pocket sevens. He's going to be open limping those, and he's going to be open limping maybe some suited connectors from that position. And definitely they like to open limp a lot of pocket pairs and suited, like weak suited ace-x, like ace-wheel suiteds. So when he open raises, he's got a pretty narrow value heavy, maybe value only merged range, linear range, but it's going to be very strong. And then if the loose aggressive player calls out of the big blind, his range is going to be, well, it's going to really be a lot more dependent on the specific lag. But it's definitely going to be, at least we would think, that the big blind, the loose aggressive player that calls from the big blind is not going to have aces or kings or queens because he would have 3-bet those. So whose range is stronger here? I mean, it's pretty obvious that the nit that open raised under the gun has got the more frequent strength on this board. He's going to have, like, you know, aces, he's going to have ace-king, he's going to have king-queen, maybe. And he's going to have, you know, ace-jack and hands that at least have showdown value. But I think an interesting note, and this is the point of this example, is even though we have a lot more frequent nutted value type stuff and frequent strength, frequent showdown value, our opponent who flat called from the big blind is probably the only one of the two players that can actually have the nuts on this board. And the player that flat called out of the big blind, the loose aggressive player that did not 3-bet but did not fold, he called from the big blind, is going to have probably a lot more flush draws on this board as well. So there are runouts that can actually favor the loose aggressive player, even though this board just crushes the nits under the gun open raising range. These are things that need to be thought about and considered to really be a good player. So let's say that the tight aggressive nit old school tag open raises under the gun, the loose aggressive player flats it from the big blind. It was a, say, 3 times the big blind open, and it's a full ring 9-handed poker game. Or maybe even it's a live game and it's 4 times the big blind. Doesn't really matter too much. How important is it that the big blind's range is actually uncapped, meaning that he can have the literal nuts? And how important is it that he will have more nutted value hands on a lot of turn cards? How big of a deal is that compared to the fact that the old school tag is just going to have more frequent good hands? First of all, what should this do to our continuation betting frequencies if we are the player that open raised from under the gun? Really, it shouldn't change it very much, and that's kind of key. If you can get your head around that concept, that even on a board that crushes your range, you shouldn't be c-betting all the time, then you can kind of start to figure out what hands you probably ought not be c-betting. So let's put let's say that this old school nit, this old school tag open raises to 4 times the big blind in a $2, $5 live cash game at whatever casino is local to you. He's got to go, and he gets an emergency call, and for whatever reason, all the players and all the players and the floor, the personnel, all allow you to take over in this guy's spot. So you have a very tight range that crushes this flop, and you sit in here and take over from the flop. Your opponent in the big blind, a loose aggressive player, checks to you on ace, king, queen. What are you going to do with ace, jack? If you've got ace of diamonds, jack of clubs, what are you doing here? If your opponent's any good, you can't continuation bet that hand. If you c-bet that flop, you're probably turning your hand into a bluff, and if you're not purely turning your hand into a bluff here, you are at the very minimum not getting the maximum value that you could, and you're not protecting the rest of the stuff that wants to check back in your range. So we shouldn't be c-betting hands like ace-jack, because in a sense we turn them into a bluff automatically straight away. And if we're going to be c-betting that hand, our check back range is going to be too weak. And if we don't check back the ace-jack, because we're going to go for more than one street of value, if we bet the flop, the turn bricks off, villain checks again, and we bet again, now we just turned our hand into a bluff, just period. So the bottom, I think the bottom of our value c-bet range might look something like king-queen with the queen of spades. That might be the worst hand that we can value bet against a good thinking player on this ace-king-queen flop. Of course, we're going to value bet sets, and we're going to have a lot of them, and we're going to value bet our two pair. But beyond that, I don't know if we should be value c-betting anything. The best hand we check might be something like ace-jack would probably be like one of the best hands we check. Now, being that we are going to check back some mediocre hands, and it might not be the worst thing in the world even to check back with like king-queen, and I don't know, like queen-jack would probably be a good check back, especially if you've got like jack of spades or the queen of spades. So there'll be a lot of turns that you can call a bet if you happen to accidentally induce a bluff, or value bet yourself if it's checked to you on the turn. But we have to be bluffing some of the time too. And since we don't have that much air to choose from, in fact, we may have no hands that are not at least a pair at this point in the hand. We have to use hands that we might not normally think of as bluffs, and we have to turn them into bluffs because they're the bottom of our range. Not only do we have license to bluff with them, and we can get our opponent to fold some better hands, but we're going to need to bet them in order to get value from the hands we would like to bet for value. So we can go ahead and take our like jack-jack with a jack of spades and turn that into a bluff. We can take tens, pocket nines, and we can turn those hands into bluffs. A pair of tens or a pair of jacks, especially with a spade to go with it, be really good semi-bluffing hands, right? And so we should be taking the top of our value, or the top of our range, and betting it for value. We should take the bottom of our range and we should bluff with it. If we're just never getting here with air, like we probably won't be, we're going to have a very hard time betting for thin value, and we're going to have a very easy time bluffing. So hands like pocket nines lose their value in like showdown value, or being able to induce bluffs and bluff catch, or induce light call downs. And so for that reason, they really, well, for a lot of reasons, we ought to be bluffing with them. So let's look at this situation. Yeah, I might not really have time to go into these other situations too much, but you can kind of look at them and kind of think them up on your own. But back to this spot here, where old school tag open raises from under the gun, and the loose aggressive player calls from the big blind, and we go to ace of spades, king of spades, queen of diamonds. What can we say about the ranges? We can say that let's just go to the turn, and let's say that the action goes like this. The big blind checks, so that's the lag, and the tight aggressive player continuation bets, and the big blind flat calls. What if the turn is the queen of spades? Now, because we could say probably that the guy that is under the gun, or I'm sorry, the guy that's in the big blind has more queen X in his range. I would say that's almost certainly the case. And he has more draws, more spade draws in his range. It's pretty hard, really, with the ace and the king out. It's pretty darn hard for the old school tag to have any flush draws in his range on this flop. So our villain from the big blind, well, our lag from the big blind, the pre-flop caller, is going to have more draws, and he's going to have more queens. So since he has more spade flush draws and he has more queen X in his range, probably he's got about equal amount. Well, I mean, it depends on if he's 3-betting king queen or not, but if he does, then he doesn't have that. But if he doesn't 3-bet ace queen against under the gun, and he doesn't 3-bet king queen, and I wouldn't. So if I'm big blind here, I'm going to have full combos of ace queen, I'm going to have full combos of king queen, and I am likely going to check and call on this flop with those hands. So when the queen comes off on the turn, If it's the queen of spades, all of my flush draws will have gotten there, and many of my two pair combos, well, all of my two pair combos just turned into a full house. So that's a spot where we went from the big blinds range being very much behind the under the gun opener's range, and with one turn card, the queen of spades, the tables have turned. Going back to the idea that the big blind can have jack 10 for the nuts straight, and the player who open raised under the gun probably can't have jack 10 for the nuts straight, how important is that? And the answer is the deeper stacks are, the more valuable it is to be uncapped. And the more shallow, or the smaller the stack to pot ratio is going to the flop, the more important it is to have frequent strength. That's the answer. And maybe we'll just look at these quickly. Loose aggressive player opens the button, tight aggressive call. Well, let's go to OS tag, open raises, early position again. We have an idea of their ranges. Loose aggressive player calls out of the big blind, and the flop comes down 8, 7, 6, two-tone. So 8 of spades, 7 of spades, 6 of diamonds. If our old school tag from under the gun, what does his range look like here? He's going to have overpairs, overcards with and without flush draws. He's really going to have no nutted value hands if we assume that he's open limping pocket eights. And if he's raising only pocket eights plus, he's got exactly pocket eights. That's his only nutted value combo that he's got in his range. He's got a ton of overcards. He's got a ton of like backdoor draws with 2 overcards. He's got some flush draws. He's got overpairs. But his range is pretty well capped. It's capped at, like, if he open limps pocket eights, then his range is really capped right here, right now, at pocket aces, 1 pair. Whereas the loose aggressive big blind calls, and he's going to have more combos of 2 pair, big draws. He's going to have some top pairs. He's going to have some sets. He's going to sometimes have the nuts. And honestly, if you put this into Equilab and you came up with some reasonable range for the big blind who's like a loose aggressive player that flat calls, I would say that he's likely going to have something most of the time. I mean, he's literally going to connect with this board probably more often than he does not. And I would even say that he's going to have like top pair plus or a big draw the majority of the time. I'm guessing. That sounds right to me. So who has the more frequent, decent strength? I would say the loose aggressive big blind does on this board. And who's got more nutted value hands? Again, that would be your loose aggressive player. Who has more air? Loose aggressive player. The tight EP tag, he has a lot of frequent strength in ace highs and overpairs. Tons of overpairs in his range. Pocket nines plus are all overpairs. So it's kind of hard to say. One player's range is just definitely stronger than the others, but the loose aggressive player, he's got more license to own this pot. And the deeper we're playing, the more license he actually has. The fact that his range can contain the nuts, or something like it that is effectively the nuts against the other guy's range, is massively huge, and the deeper we are, the bigger it is. At 100 big blinds, it's pretty important. At 200 big blinds, it's everything. At 20 big blinds, it doesn't mean that much. Pocket aces are going to get it in on this flop if it's like a 4-bet pot or something like that with standard stack depths. So that's a big point that I think you ought to think about and take away. I want that to be definitely one of the takeaways here. So what does that do to the strategies? Well, the first thing it does is it gives the lag complete license to donk, and he can really go flop, turn, and river with a wide range, and there's not an awful lot that the tag can do about it. He can also, if he thinks the tight aggressive player is going to make a continuation bet exploitatively often, if he's going to c-bet this flop too much, which might be c-betting it at all, then he can check raise, bomb turn, bomb river, and like EP tag is just so rarely going to be able to do anything to combat that. In fact, you really shouldn't try. And the first step is, if I get here as the early position opener with pocket aces, I'm checking it back. If I get here with ace king, I'm checking it back. Even if I get here with pocket eights, I'm checking it back. Think about that. Why am I checking it back? How does it make sense? In what way does it make sense? Yeah, the deeper we are, the more kind of screwed EP tag is if villain can play it at all. Okay, looking over here, lag opens button, tag calls from the big blind. Very different situation, right? The ranges are going to be a lot different. Now we've switched the positions that the players are in. So if the loose aggressive opener is, let's see, lag opens button, tag calls. Yeah, and we go to, let's skip this guy and let's just go down here. This is going to be similar. Okay, so lag opens button, tag flats from the big blind, and we go to a flop of ace 5-5. I think this is an interesting spot, and I'll tell you why. As big blind, if we check, I think we can expect the pre-flop raiser to bet this spot a lot. I think players, they just in general overemphasize how important the ace X factor is and how many ace X combos the pre-flop raiser has in their range. And if a lag opens from the button and the tag flats from the big blind, this board texture is a little bit tougher to say that it goes in one direction or another. I would say the button has more frequent mediocrity, some kind of strength. The big blind has fewer ace X's overall, but he's got probably better ace X's, but then again, he doesn't have the best ace X's. We assume he would 3-bet ace king and maybe ace queen also. So the button has an uncapped range, more or less, right? They can both have quads. The button has more like ace king, and pocket aces are in his range. So the button has an uncapped range. The big blind has more frequent nutted value. And this actually creates some interesting dynamics, especially when it's a board texture. We can't expect pre-flop raiser to maybe incorrectly c-bet too often. If button has all ace X, including pocket aces, and he has one combo of 5-5, he has ace 5 suited, his range is going to look to him like he's got a lot of good hands. If big blind is going to have fewer ace X, and we know big blind will probably have fewer ace X combos, and he's going to have very few combos of 5X. It's probably going to be exactly 5-5, maybe 6-5 suited, maybe not, maybe ace 5 suited, maybe not. It looks like a board that hits the open raiser's range harder, but actually if we assume that the open raiser, this loose aggressive player, is going to be opening really wide against a tight player, if he's opening something like the most reasonable 50% of all starting hands from the button, there's no way that this flop is better for his range than for the tight aggressive player who flats from the button or the big blind. This is a very neutral flop. It hits our ranges in different ways, but it's really hard to say that one has more nutted stuff and one has it really. Who does this favor? This flop actually favors the player who had the best hand before the flop. Now, the pre-flop raiser had the least capped range pre-flop. But pre-flop caller's range, if you've ever heard of the gap concept, especially when he's out of position, he's going to have a stronger range in general. It takes a stronger hand to call a raise than to open raise, right? And although he will have folded more of his ace-X combos pre-flop, he will have folded more of his hands overall pre-flop. And that means that his ratio of ace-X to non-ace-X is probably going to be higher. I bet that the tight aggressive player that flats the big blind has more ace-X combos in his range than the loose aggressive does who opens the button as pre-flop raiser. I think if we say that the lag opens the button 50% of the time or thereabout, he's going to miss this completely like 2/3 of the time. He's going to have like top pair or better, like 1 time out of 5. And I've played with Equilab Poker Stove enough that I have a pretty strong intuition about this. I bet I'm going to be within 5-6% most of the time. So he's going to have like a couple combos of 5X. He's going to have like 5-5, but 3/4 of the time, 3/4 of the time thereabouts, he's going to be pretty weak. And by pretty weak here, I mean hands as strong as pocket kings. He's going to be like, he's going to not have top pair or better the vast majority of the time. But what about the tag in the big blind? Okay, he's going to make a made hand that's one pair plus. I bet like 80% of the time. Like, what does he have that really misses? He's going to have some kind of pocket pair or some kind of ace a very high percent of the time. And he's going to have ace X, quads, pocket pairs. You know, he's going to have some kind of a, pocket pair an awful lot. I bet you he's got an ace a good third of the time. So, yeah, you could say more. He's going to have more decent aces, but he's going to have less ace-king, obviously. But he starts with fewer ace-x combos, but his ratio of ace-x to non-ace-x is actually higher. So what should we do about that? How should we play in regards to that? I think this is kind of interesting. It's a neutralish board that we can expect our opponent, who, if we're the big blind, we can expect our opponent to probably continuation bet this flop way too often. And I think that means that since we have a neutral flop, it means that the stronger starting range is still stronger. So the guy with the more polarized range, pre-flop raiser, he's still the more polarized player. He's still going to have the more polarized distribution. He's going to have more bluffs and more nutted value. The pre-flop caller is still going to have the bound, capped, but overall stronger range. And so how should we play this? If we're the big blind, I think we check to the raiser because A, the big blind has more bluff catchers. B, pre-flop raisers more polarized. C, people tend to value ace X X boards in favor of the pre-flop raiser far too much. D, we have good reason to slow play. It does make a lot of sense for us as the big blind to slow play on this flop because we can expect our opponent to bet this. And I think that also, E, we're going to want to turn some hands into bluffs, but we want to do this in a way that we can realistically represent the types of hands we're most likely going to be trying to play for value. So, if we check to the raiser, I think we should do a lot of check calling on this flop with our entire range. If we're thinking about our range, what it looks like to our opponent, what we're repping, how often we want to split it, most of our range is going to want to check and call here. So if we're going to mostly check and call with our bluff catchers, and we mostly have bluff catchers in our range, if we do anything else, we polarize our range, we make our overall game plan easier to play against and easier to read. So I think we should start as big blind by check calling our entire range on this flop. And when the turn card comes, if we check again and villain bets, button bets again, we can check raise a lot here. We can check raise any air that we're deciding to float. We can check raise our value hands, and we can probably check raise just the top of our range and the bottom of our range, and we can still check call some. Now, if this turn card bricks off and it goes check check, when the river card comes out, we should be betting a ton. For reasons that I guess I'm kind of going to have to get into another time. Just real quickly, we'll use this as like homework to keep in the put in the comment section. If a lag opens the button and a tag calls from the big blind, and we see a flop of 7-4-3 rainbow, who has the stronger range overall? Who has more frequent decent hands? Who has the least capped range, the more nutted value hands? Who has more air? How should that influence our play? And one more question. This is like really the bonus question. This is the big one. Who should be betting that flop more often? The loose aggressive player that opens the button, or the tight aggressive player that calls from the big blind? So, in conclusion, having a range advantage allows the player with a stronger range to bluff more effectively, makes it tougher for the player with a stronger range to get value, and should be the incentive to be the first player to bet, rather than that incentive somehow going to the player who has this magical thing called initiative. Playing without range advantage, it should discourage us from bluffing. It's based on reality. It's not just a theoretical concept. It should encourage you to slow play and take non-procedural actions some of the time. Playing without range advantage is tough. It gives villain a license to steal from you, and it gives you very little recourse. It should make you tons of money when you actually have a good hand, and it could be a good place not to just leak off a bunch of chips once you recognize this concept. So look to leverage your range advantage when you have it. Construct ranges that are going to allow you to A, leverage range advantage when you don't have the actual hands that you rep, and B, get to more situations where your opponent is going to think that you have nothing when you do in fact have something. Those are both going to be the same adjustment. We're going to just adjust our pre-flop ranges for better board coverage. Play your range, not your hand, whenever it's close. Be mindful, and that means don't split your range unnecessarily. Be mindful where your hand sits within your overall distribution. Think range advantage, not pre-flop initiative, as a reason to c-bet or to bet the flop. Donking on boards that hit your range harder is something you ought to be looking to do more. C-betting air into villains boards is probably a leak. Value betting less, bluffing more when you're the player that has range advantage is a good idea. And always consider range advantage when you're considering slow play. So that's going to do it. Till next time, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave questions and comments below, and good luck.